series. I'm Amy Boski, and with my colleague Jim Keenan, we're here. I've had the great pleasure this year of helping to found this new series focused on the theme of histories and futures within the larger project of considering seminal topics in health, history, and humanities. Health, humanities, and ethics. Speakers this year have addressed a range of topics, challenging us to consider pressing problems, past and future, that deserve our engagement. It seems highly appropriate that we close the series with remarks from Professor Steve Hyman, a leader in the fields of neuroscience and mental health. Here to introduce Steve tonight is Eugene Francis, a sophomore in the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences, majoring in international studies with a global health concentration and minoring in medical humanities. Last year, my colleague Jim Keenan suggested when we launched the series with an address by Paul Farmer that we invite undergraduates to introduce our speakers for this first inaugural year. So just a few words about Eugene. Eugene is a presidential scholar at Boston College, originally from Miami. A pre-med student, she has interned at the East Boston Neighborhood Health Center and at the Suffolk County House of Corrections. She's involved on campus with GlobeMed and took part with other members of her presidential scholar class in a social justice project called Overlooked and Overdosed. Before Eugene comes up to introduce Dr. Hyman, can I ask everyone here please to silence cell phones? And now, Eugene, thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending the last event in this year's Park Street Corporation Speaker Series. Like Professor Boski said, my name is Eugene Francis, and I am a sophomore pre-med international studies major, concentrating in global health, and a minor in the medical humanities program. In this very room, I and 13 other sophomores held our first event of our social justice project on the opioid crisis, titled Overlooked and Overdosed: Stories of Recovery Road. We had the opportunity to showcase the many moving stories of amazing professionals working to fight the crisis, as well as a couple members of the Boston College community affected by this crisis. Although the opioid crisis has only recently attracted national attention, it has been a serious problem for almost 2 decades. Opioids are addictive, pain-numbing medications such as morphine, heroin, fentanyl, and methadone. The number of deaths from opioids in the United States has quadrupled since 1999. Today, 78 people will die from opioids, 4 in Massachusetts alone. Drug overdoses are the leading cause of injury death in the nation, causing more deaths than car accidents and guns. Addiction is not a choice. It literally alters the chemistry of your brain, making recovery more difficult. Due to my work on this project, I feel privileged to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Stephen E. Hyman is the director of the Stanley Center for Psychiatric Research at the Broad Institute of Harvard University and MIT, and a distinguished service professor of stem cell and regenerative biology at Harvard University. Dr. Hyman graduated summa cum laude from Yale College in 1974. He then attended the University of Cambridge as a Mellon Fellow, studying the history and philosophy of science, and received his master's in 1976. He earned his MD from Harvard Medical School in 1980 cum laude. Dr. Hyman served as the 2014-2015 president of the Society for Neuroscience, as well as the provost of Harvard University from 2001 to 2011. From 1996 to 2001, he was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, the component of the U.S. National Institutes of Health, charged with generating the knowledge needed to understand and treat mental illness. Before serving as director of the NIMH, Dr. Hyman was professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, director of psychiatry research at Massachusetts General Hospital, and the first faculty director of Harvard University's Mind, Brain, and Behavior Initiative. Dr. Hyman is a member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a fellow of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. He is the editor of the Annual Review of Neuroscience. His cutting-edge research and theories have greatly influenced the fields of molecular neuroscience, molecular biology, and psychiatry. Dr. Hyman serves on multiple nonprofit boards, including the Dana Foundation and the Charles Revson Foundation, on the boards of 2 biotechnology companies, Voyager Therapeutics and Q-State, and the multiple scientific advisory boards. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. Dr. Hyman was awarded the 2016 Rhoda and Bernard Sarnett International Prize in Mental Health. Dr. Hyman has been described as a great leader who speaks his mind even when holding unpopular beliefs. Through the numerous roles Dr. Hyman has taken on, he has greatly contributed to the investment in neuroscience and emerging genetic technologies, initiated a series of large practical clinical trials with an emphasis on children, and studied how emerging genetics results in autism, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorders, which can yield an incisive neurobiological experience and how we might, as a result, accelerate much-needed new therapeutics. In the laboratory, he has studied the regulation of gene expression by neurotransmitters, especially dopamine and drugs that act on dopamine receptors. Dr. Hyman has been credited with raising the scientific bar for research, taking strong stands on issues like psychiatric research ethics, serving as an eloquent ambassador on Capitol Hill, building bridges between basic scientists and clinical researchers, and extending a welcoming hand to advocacy groups like the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. It is a great honor having Dr. Hyman here with us tonight. So with that, please help me in welcoming to Boston College, Dr. Stephen D.
Well, that was so kind. Of course, I can't possibly live up to that. And I'll have to figure out where you got some of your sources of information. When people say I sometimes espouse unpopular views, what I say is, fortunately for me, I don't have to be liked. It's a temperamental trait. It's interesting that you mentioned the opioid crisis in this context, because I think some of the things I'm going to talk about with respect to attributions of moral agency are now front and center in our nation. And as tragically, more and more families and policymakers face the ravages of the opioid epidemic, we're beginning to rethink some of the harsh views that are so common on addiction. Let me just say that to make some of the points I want to make, I'm going to delve into some neurobiological explanation. I'm going to try to make it completely accessible. We're not here to learn about particular molecules or circuits, but it's also not helpful if I talk in terms of generalities and science fiction. So if this address turns into babbling, please stop me and ask for clarification. Okay. So first I want to contrast in quite simplistic terms the ethical frameworks that in many ways are mapped onto differing views of addiction. So the classical view, you can find these views in the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, but also they're really at the root of Anglo-American jurisprudence, are that people freely form intentions and act upon them when people are also aware of the likely consequences of their actions. They are in desert of praise or blame. And then the legal system adds that such an act, if performed with criminal intent, and again, intentionality and control of behavior is really central and will be central to our discussion of addiction. Under those circumstances, people deserve punishment, and we'll get back to the kinds of punishments, but this includes blame, that is retributive punishment, attributions for a moral flaw. In contrast, neurobiology is entirely materialist. I'm glad I'm not giving this talk here 100 years ago, because these views would not probably have been all that welcome. But the idea is that all of our decision making and our behavior occur not freely, but within causal chains. Now this causation can be complicated. It's not like one billiard ball knocking into another, but some of it comes from your memory or lived experience. Nonetheless, every decision is constrained by prior events of prior causation. And the decisions that we make, and the decisions to move, result from unconscious mechanisms that are absolutely opaque to introspection. Now we tell ourselves that we, through introspection, understand our reasons, but a neurobiologist would say that that's not actually the case, that deeper mechanisms, and we may talk about this later, are really controlling such aspects of our lives. And in addition, the kind of automatic moral attributions we make about people, both the automatic implicit biases that we make in everyday life, but also the attributions of moral turpitude to addicts and so forth, are not deep reflections about justice, but rather evolutionary concepts or evolutionary mechanisms that have everything to do with survival. That is, in some putative state of nature, like, you know, a dark city street. We don't have to put ourselves back in Paleolithic times. Judging a book by its cover is not such a bad thing, because it's better to run away than to find out later that this individual meant you harm. Nonetheless, the idea is that these moral attributions and reactions are not rooted necessarily in concepts of justice. So, again, at the risk of caricature, there are really two general models of addiction, and my introducer seemed to be sympathetic to the second, the medical model, but there is still a very influential moral model, and anyone who doubts that should just look at the harshness of the penalties that are heaped upon even nonviolent addictive drug offenders in federal law. And despite recent attempts of the Federal Sentencing Commission, mandatory minimum sentences are still really rather remarkable, and people with drug offenses, for example, can't get Pell Grants to attend college, whereas people who have committed serious violent felonies can. And so there is this powerful moral attribution. At any rate, this model suggests that excessive drug use, it represents a poor choice that elevates hedonic state, escape from distress, over good pro-social goals. The medical model, in contrast, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about and try to justify, suggests that addiction represents compulsive drug use despite negative consequences and loss of control. So compulsive drug use despite negative consequences, sort of a legalistic statement. You know, you can find it in the DSM-5 or the International Classification of Diseases, but it means that, you know, somebody, despite a smoker, let's take a legal drug, despite health consequences, obstructive lung disease, despite all kinds of threats and warnings from physician and family, and despite knowing, cold cognition says, you know, this is bad for me, I should stop, continues to smoke. And obviously, there are people who use opiates who are more than well aware at some point that this is killing them, that their spouse wants to leave them, that they're going to be fired from their job. Again, they're suffering health consequences, and yet, despite these negative messages, they continue to use. Again, under the moral model, that's just a very bad judgment. Under the medical model, that's considered to be compulsion. Now, the nice thing for neuroethics, the sort of thinking about issues like personhood and agency and so forth, what addiction does, even with these caricatured models, is to problematize the idea of voluntary action. And I'm going to assert that we can do that without getting into the nitty-gritty of the free will determinism debate, because we can argue this really at the level of empirical biological mechanisms. Now, the moral model has a certain advantage over the medical model because it's highly intuitive. And I call this human experience, but some lawyers, the legal scholar Stephen Morris at the University of Pennsylvania, says, look, this is folk psychology. And he doesn't mean that in a derogatory way. He means, this is human self-understanding. And all of us, even when I'm lecturing on neurobiology to my undergraduates or graduate students, and saying that there's no such thing as a self, I experience a self. I can't avoid it. It's ineluctable. I experience myself as having experiences, as deciding freely, and causing my actions. And this, we can, for shorthand, call it implicit Cartesian dualism, is instantiated in the first person pronoun that's ubiquitous. I do this, not complex mechanisms in my brain cause this without my awareness, despite what I think. And I have this sense of being the author of my actions. Whereas, in fact, neurobiology would say the sense of authoring your actions is actually a result of your motor mechanisms, not the cause. So the neuroscience view finds no place in the brain for this I, for this self. Certainly not in older psychiatric formulations, the Freudian ego and hidden superego. The science is fully materialist, and there is no subjective thought or action apart from the workings of the brain, which are physical objects, part of causal chains. And the experience of a self that we all have, that I have, is, again, it's really the result of our actions, not the cause. And the idea is that evolution has sort of played a trick on us, giving us this authorship illusion, because it's not bad for the organism to know what it's about to do, and so forth. Now, some philosophers, some neurobiologists who take this materialist view then say that this experience of agency is an illusion. And I think that's actually quite unfair. Evolution was not, I don't want to tell evolutionary tall tales. Evolutionary psychology drives me a bit around the bend because we don't have the fossil record of what was actually happening. But I don't think, one even just thinking in terms of a modern human being, it's hard to see how a parlor trick or an illusion would be worth all of the structural formations of the brain and all of the energy. And in fact, you can see that this sense of self, sense of agency is actually not only critical, but its lack is associated with psychopathology. So the difference between something that's stressful but where you feel agency, sort of like if you like driving a car on a challenging road, it can be stressful, but when you arrive safely, you feel like you've done something. In contrast, if the steering wheel, if you're hydroplaning because it's pouring rain and you feel a lack of control, you don't feel agency. That stress is damaging to our health. You can measure stress hormones, changes in blood pressure, change in heart rate. So that's why I say, even though neurobiologists will say that the way we experience agency is not true, not veridical, I think dismissing it as a mere illusion as opposed to part of the way we are constructed, mechanisms to keep us healthy, is simplistic and unfair. Similarly, somebody who can't automatically, and when I mean automatically, I mean without effort, hard to inhibit, intentions to others, good or bad, that is someone who lacks a theory of mind, we say often when we examine them, also has some sort of psychopathology on the autism spectrum. Right? That is the inability to attribute intentions to other people turns out to be disabling among our very highly social species. So by taking the neurobiological point of view, I'm not trying to devalue these critical human experiences. All I'm trying to say, which is enough of a claim, is that they don't actually capture the way decisions and actions get formulated. And that could be several hours right there. So I think I'm going to back off. But turn it around to addiction now. Given these reflections, somebody might have questions for a neurobiologist. about compulsion or loss of control. Someone with the moral model could say, now wait a minute, neurobiologist, what do you mean a person loses control? I mean, after all, if somebody wants to get an illegal drug, they've got a plan, they've got to be stealthy, they've got to get money, they've got to find their dealer, they've got to buy drugs, they've got to find a place to prepare them. If it's heroin or fentanyl that's going to be injected, they have to prepare the drug, heat it up, put on a tourniquet. Now, that seems like a very complex, well-planned series of voluntary acts. And you're telling me someone has lost control over that series of actions. What could that mean? Also, you know, we all do things in the heat of the moment, right? Things that we regret. We're sort of feeling hot emotion, desire, what have you. You know I shouldn't have that extra piece of cake. Instead, you know, I jump up on the table. Well, not quite. But given the extended time frame of obtaining resources and drugs and so forth, surely the addicted person has time to, even if we don't ascribe free will to them, to exert free won't. That is, to exert cognitive control and stop these actions. So the question is, are you saying that these, you know, if an addicted person, if they're not an unfettered moral agent, you know, who is would fit the Aristotelian framework, are they a zombie? I mean, what are you saying? Or is it something in between? And what evidence do you have that any of this is other than a story that is concocted around people saying they can't control themselves? Okay. Well, so now we have to go back to, it's rare actually to be able to, for scientists, you know, Aristotle, obviously, we're in 300 BC, but it's rare for scientists to be able to quote a paper from 1923, but Ivan Pavlov really, in some ways, sets up the beginnings of some of our ideas about how compulsion occurs. So Pavlov conditioned dogs. He was actually a digestive physiologist. He was mostly interested in eliciting saliva and digestive juices, but nonetheless, he came to the realization that his behavioral interpretations were the more important bits. And that basically, for a dog, a piece of meat is an unconditioned stimulus. That is, innately given in evolution, the dog will try to consume the meat. But Pavlov had a bell that made a tinkle that had no meaning at all to the dog. That is, until he rang the bell at a fixed interval, maybe a few seconds before the meat appeared, and then the bell takes on a certain motivational salience to the dog. It becomes a conditioned stimulus. And the dog now, when it hears the bell, even if the meat isn't there, it begins to salivate and prepare to eat the meat. So one other old experiment before we try to connect this to drugs, this was Olds and Milner in Canada in 1953. They were doing a very Skinnerian behavioral experiment. They were asking whether, if they put an electrode in different regions of a rodent brain, were there regions of the brain where the rodent would work for electrical current? That is, the electrode was attached to a lever, and when the lever was pressed, there would be electrical stimulation. And they found that there were a small number of locations of the brain where the rodent would actually not only press the lever, but would press thousands of times in succession, would not eat or drink. Many, given unlimited access to the lever pressing, most of these rodents would actually die. And when they looked, I don't have a pointer at where it was. This is a rodent brain, front of the brain, back of the brain. It was in a pathway, the medial forebrain bundle, that caused the release of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And brain neurons communicate with each other with chemicals. Dopamine is one of those chemicals. And the pop psychology literature called this the pleasure centers and things like that. But actually, what they had discovered is a reward circuit. And what is a reward circuit? Well, in evolution, again, hope not to tell evolutionary psychology tall tales, but you can see conserved in free-living animals fear systems and reward systems that have to do with survival. So, and of course, the world is unpredictable, so these systems really have to learn, right? So, focusing on reward, in order to survive, you have to prioritize the ability to obtain food and water and safety and mating opportunities, and you have to, under those circumstances, approach and if it's food or water, consume those things. And as we'll see, the reward circuit helps you learn what those things are that serve your needs and cause you to really remember those things really well. And if we go back to Pavlov, they imbue any clue that there's a reward nearby with motivational salience. They paint it with a different meaning than it had before. And the reward circuit reorganizes behavior to maximize future reward. And that's what's called positive reinforcement. The rodent would keep pushing the lever. And of course, I showed you a rodent brain, but humans actually have the very same reward circuit. This is against an old MRI scan based in your brainstem and your midbrain. There's a nucleus, the ventral tegmental area, that releases dopamine under the right circumstances into your forebrain, and we'll come back to this. The nucleus accumbens for you Latinists. It means the leaning nucleus. It impressed some neuroanatomists that way, and your prefrontal cortex. And here's just another picture of this circuit in the human brain. And so here is the one really awful slide in this talk. And I didn't know how to make this point without this absolutely awful slide. So just bear with me for a second. So Old and Milner found that if they had an electrode in a rat's brain that caused dopamine release, the rat would just keep pressing and pressing and pressing. That actually sounds like dopamine is the brain's internal representation of, euphoria or goodness or happiness. And people believed that for a long time, but these experiments by a man named Wolfram Schultz, who's now at the University of Cambridge, showed that dopamine really was something very different. It's really about shaping behavior to maximize reward. So what he did is he had a macaque monkey that was sitting in a chair that had an electrode implanted in its dopamine neurons that could tell when the dopamine neurons fired. And these monkeys, it sounds, if you've never seen these kinds of experiments, they sound really awful, but the monkey, except for having this protrusion, the monkey is healthy and lives for many years and so forth. And the idea was that the monkey liked this sweet syrup. So it would be sitting in a chair, and a little door would open, and this very rewarding sweet syrup would appear, and the monkey would drink it. And their dopamine neurons would fire. And this is like Pavlov, that's why I showed you Pavlov before, just delivering the meat without the bell, okay? So this is called a raster plot, the dopamine neurons at rest, just firing a little bit. And when the door opens, the syrup arrives, and all of a sudden they fire faster. I think you can see this on the little bar graph at the top. That still could be a pleasure signal. But when you add Pavlov's bell, or in this case, Wolfram Schultz's bell or light or whatever, all of a sudden, what happens is that the dopamine is released when it hears the bell. And then when the reward comes, there's no more dopamine, as long as the reward is exactly as predicted. Now, I wanted to minimize the number of slides. If Schultz had a light that predicted the bell, that predicted the reward, now dopamine would only be released when the light came on. There'd be no dopamine at the bell and no dopamine at the reward. If, Pavlov would call this an extinction experiment, but if Schultz is in a testy mood and omits the syrup, the conditioned stimulus, the bell rings, the dopamine is released, but now look, remember there's this baseline little firing of dopamine neurons. When the syrup was expected, the dopamine neurons pause. It's a punishment signal. If, in this experiment, the syrup were double the portion, you'd actually get dopamine. So here's the interpretation. There's a lot of experiments, a lot of people, but here's the interpretation of what dopamine is doing. It's detecting an error in prediction. Dopamine fires at the first reliable predictor of a reward, right? Before the bell, the environment was this boring old environment, and then out of the blue, the bell rings, and dopamine basically is saying, you know, that is salient, that's important. But when there's nothing more to learn, good or bad, dopamine is just as it always was, okay? So dopamine shapes behavior, and you'll see, well, I'll show you in other circuits. Extra dopamine means, you know, that was good, learn this, right? We could put ourselves out, you know, let's imagine we're leaving a subsistence life in the wilderness, and we find a place with good berries or good fish. You know, that's salient, learn that, learn the path, don't forget it, right? So dopamine shapes behavior to maximize future reward. And transient changes in firing show that we were missing something. You know, the bell before it's, if we have no prior clue, comes out of nowhere, and so on and so forth. Okay. And humans have this too, right? Here's an experiment with a functional MRI, which is showing brain activity, and you get a thirsty human and you give it water, and when the water just appears out of nowhere, the dopamine neurons in the human, this is the front of the brain and the back of the brain and the bottom and the top, and this is the midbrain with dopamine, lights up if the reward comes out of the blue. If the reward is exactly as expected, it's middling, and if the human has a, you know, it's a Pavlovian experiment, expects water, it's signaled and it doesn't arrive, dopamine neuron decreases. These are really, this is a simplistic experiment, it's humans in an imager, but these are universal mechanisms. Okay. So, what does this have to do with addiction? Well, one question is, how is it, this is an opium poppy, you know, how is it that a plant extract can usurp human life, can take over somebody's life? And I'm showing you actually not opiates, I could have, but amphetamine. It's because addictive drugs turn out to be Trojan horses. They look enough like a neurotransmitter to fool parts of the brain. So here is dopamine itself, and here is amphetamine. The amphetamine looks enough like dopamine to plug up a protein channel that normally would clear dopamine from neural connections, from synapses, and you get this big excess of dopamine. Opiates mimic in the brain endogenous neurotransmitters, endorphins and enkephalins. Again, they are Trojan horses. And you know, if you think about it, I mean, we don't know whether there was some selection, some coevolution of these plant alkaloids with humans. Some people think caffeine was actually an insecticide that protected plants. I mean, who knows? But, you know, before the Neolithic Revolution, humans scoured the planet looking for nutritious, tasty plants, and they found just a small, very small number that they really liked. Opium poppies and cannabis and coca leaves and so forth. that contained, again, a chemical that mimicked a neurotransmitter. And each one of these natural products mimics a neurotransmitter that directly or indirectly causes dopamine to be released in this reward circuit. Okay, I don't want to go through this chart. Everybody will fall asleep. It's late, but take my word for it. Okay. So what do addictive drugs do? Addictive drugs are drugs that can directly or indirectly cause dopamine release in this reward circuit. And what I tell you this reward circuit was about, it was about survival. It was about learning, this is important, this is good, let's do this again, and let's remember exactly how we did it. It evolved to ensure that our first priority was, natural rewards, food, water, shelter, mating, things like that we needed for survival and the survival of the species. And now, it turns out there's a pharmacologic agent that can short circuit all of the, struggle to find something good and tell the brain, this is important. Now, how does it do that? Well, in the nucleus accumbens, that is where the part of the brain where literally Pavlov's bell, metaphorically, becomes painted with motivational salience. That's where sensory information about cues, about signals, about things that predict reward, get connected with dopamine to say, remember this. Now, that sounds pretty abstract, but think about it. All day long, you walk around campus, you go to classes, you do things, you're bombarded by innumerable sensory stimuli. You pay attention to a tiny fraction of those. And if you can't focus the spotlight of attention, life gets pretty hard, right? It's very, very distracting. But people even with ADHD focus to some degree the spotlight of attention. And of the things you attend to, you remember even fewer. And and speaking of ADHD, the drugs that we use to treat ADHD all are amphetamine derivatives. They release dopamine. So what does that do? It makes that boring old math homework much more salient. It makes it, it paints it with emotional salience and makes it important. So you learn this, it's telling you. Does it work well enough? I don't want to get into that discussion, but it is literally tapping into this very salience mechanism. So that's in the nucleus accumbens. In the bottom, this is the brain upside down, looking up from the orbits, from the eyes. Here in the orbital prefrontal cortex, we store values. Okay, so I don't want to get into philosophical values. Let's do something much more simple. When I go to a restaurant and I say, I should try something new. I like new things, but I always order pepperoni pizza, right? And somehow, and even if I sometimes plan to do something else, I have an implicit rank order of what I like, what I think is good. Now, of course, life is more complicated than a menu in a restaurant, but we pursue, we value many things over other things. When you're artificially releasing a lot of dopamine because you're taking a drug, that creates a pathologic learning signal, right? So you internalize that, this alleyway where I'm shooting up, this is a good place, and when I come to this alleyway, it's a signal that I have a reward waiting, and drugs get prioritized over other things. I have a slide for this later, but I could say right now, remember that when a reward is omitted in that Schultz experiment, you get this punishment signal, right? Dopamine neurons stop. But that's for natural rewards, right? So let's say I bite into a good-looking apple, but instead I find rot and a worm. I don't release dopamine, quite the contrary. You know, I might develop an aversion, and I might devalue, you know, that kind of apple. But now, let's say a smoker who's got lung disease takes a big drag, but is addicted, takes a big drag and starts coughing up blood. Horrible experience. Does a cigarette get devalued? Well, no, because it is directly pharmacologically releasing dopamine in his brain. So while the guy is choking and having a miserable experience, his brain, or at least parts of his brain, is getting the message, that was good. Let's do it again. Let's remember exactly how we did it, right? So the pharmacology of these small number of drugs that release dopamine basically short circuit everything else. They override everything else in the brain. And remember, this is the survival circuit, right? So that's in some ways what starts to happen. Now the other thing is important motor behaviors, motor programs that we all do become automatic. Before I get to drugs, I'll just say that when you're learning, if some of you are athletes and you learn to throw a fastball or to do a particular complicated dive, or you're a dancer or a musician and you're learning, internalizing your part in Beethoven's Ninth or what have you, first, you pay a lot of attention, right? And you remember each step that your coaches or your teachers are teaching you. But at some point when they're learned, they become automatic, right? And in fact, if you actually think, if you actually come out of an automatic routine and think about it, you usually mess up, right? And if you are doing an acrobatic routine or a dance or a musical performance, and you make an error, what do? You try to get back into the flow, into the automatic behavior. And it's a different part of the brain. When you're consciously putting one foot in front of another and keeping your eye on it, you're using your cerebral cortex. When you've learned something well, when you've overlearned it, you're using a deeper part of the brain called the striatum over here. This is a sort of a cartoon caricature. The anatomy is exploded. And, you know, it's a little bit like, I mean, it's always, people always say you never forget how to ride a bike. But you can forget how you learned, right? I mean, some of you might remember or tell yourself a story. You know, I was 4 years old and my mother, you know, had me push off on the curb. But mostly we don't know how we learned these skills in detail. The skills become independent of conscious cognition. And what is solidifying these learning mechanisms? Why it's dopamine. And we see this fall apart in Parkinson's disease. People lose dopamine and they lose their smooth and automatic motor movements. So now again, we have a pathologic dopamine signal. And people overlearn these automatic drug-seeking routines. And the reason I gave you the example of learning a musical piece or a dance or an athletic performance is you're not a zombie, it's not inflexible, because something may go wrong, and then you right yourself, but you can get back into the routine. And so it is with learning your routine for drug seeking and stereotypically, you know, rolling your cigarette or heating up your heroin. And the other thing is these behaviors that are overlearned become habits. They're released by cues, right? So somebody is walking along and they smell the smell of a crack pipe, or they see the friend with whom they shoot up, or they pass a bar, or they taste a little bit of alcohol. And it releases these automatic drug-seeking behaviors, so that the behaviors now become independent of cognitive goals, right? To put it another way, somebody might have the goal of being sober, right? but they come across a reminder, a cue, right, Pavlov's bell, and it's releasing these drug-seeking routines. Okay, so you can skip this. Skip this. So it's sort of confusing, right? Because the drug addict, and this begins to answer one of the questions at the beginning, the drug addict has drug seeking that's initiated by a cue, and yet to say they can't help themselves seems odd to people, because if instead of their pusher, they run across these guys, they don't walk up to the policeman and say, can I buy a bag of heroin? They make a different plan, right? So that's like in an athletic routine falling down. The difference is that in an athletic routine, you don't experience what the drug addicted person experiences then, which is intense drug craving. So drug seeking is released by a cue. These overlearned behavioral mechanisms are released. They are flexible, but if they're defeated, then people have intense desire. And one way, by the way, of creating this intense desire isn't just running into a policeman, it's deciding you're going to cut down, deciding you're not going to smoke again. And then you're in a situation where you normally smoke and you have intense craving. Or deciding you're not going to drink again, and you're in a situation where you would normally drink, or there's some cue, but it's inhibited. The seeking is inhibited, and people have intense craving. And we can actually see this in the brain. We can show people, picture as a control of sticks and a spoon or something, but if you show them drug paraphernalia and they're really addicted, and this is a picture that speaks to them for whatever reason, you can see in the brain scan this intense activation of the nucleus accumbens, and they say that they are intensely craving. Okay, so can we begin to put this together? Well, dopamine exists in this survival circuit, this reward circuit, and I introduced to you how we first learned about it and a little bit about what it does. But what it does is it in the nucleus accumbens, dopamine imbues cues with incentive salience. Now, I'm talking about the intensity of drug cues, but it's part of all of life, right? You smell freshly baking bread, that has incentive salience. You learn that it signifies something good at the other end. Only, because freshly baked bread does release dopamine, but not as much as cocaine. You don't overlearn it in the same way. It creates pathological valuation, right? Because drugs are being experienced under this pathologic dopamine signal. And it creates drug-seeking habits, motor behaviors that are divorced from goals. And then finally, it also, in a way I haven't shown you, I skipped over, a little bit impairs top-down cognitive control. So here's the problem. We can't see this, right? We can't look into people's brains. This is invisible. And a lot of it has been learned in mouse and rat and monkey models, not in human beings. And what families experience, what police officers, what physicians experience, is the frustrating reality of a person who just keeps drinking, keeps using opiates, even though they've lost their job, they're not functioning, they're irritable, they're beating people up. And finally, for all this effort, you get them into treatment, and they come back, and there's just some modest reminder, right? There's the friend who they drink with or whatever, and they're off to the races again. And you say, what is wrong with you? You've just been through the tortures of the damned, right, in this rehab. You had severe withdrawal, you had intense craving, and so on and so on. And you just threw it all away. And the person usually can't even explain it, or they make up an excuse. But the issue is that their brain, it's not just that they've changed their brain chemically, what I'm trying to show you, they're rewired. They basically usurp this survival circuit under this this very strange accident that there happen to be chemicals out in the world that overstimulate this circuit, that mimic dopamine. Now, it's not entirely unique because we also have this survival circuit for fear and avoidance of deadly danger. And we know that in some people that can be usurped. That's post-traumatic stress disorder. So having these survival circuits normally serves us very well, but they also set us up under certain circumstances for things that can go wrong and can be very, very damaging. And again, you can tell a very similar story about PTSD, but on the fear and avoidance, not on the reward and approach side of things. The only thing is that we don't punish people, generally don't punish people for having PTSD. Whereas in drug policy, these people make us so angry. We have these automatic attributions because we can't see, these neurobiological mechanisms don't seem real. Right? What we see is a person acting, and we intuit that we have freedom and we have self-control, and we attribute these things to other people. And instead of, a lot of us think about consequentialist justice, meaning, how might we rehabilitate this person, what would be proportionate justice. But overwhelmingly, society still is expressing retributivist moral outrage, right? Which is the evolutionary response to some dangerous vector of danger in our society, somebody we really want to drive out of the city because they're going to do us all of this harm. So where do we go from here? Well, again, I think it's hard to say there's any silver lining to the opiate crisis because it's just, as we heard from our introducer, it's now the leading cause of accidental death. But to make that really plain, there are more deaths now by opiate overdose than by road traffic accidents, which is really quite remarkable. But if enough families and communities start to see that people like them, loved ones, can be trapped in this way, and that they weren't bad people before they became associated with opiates and it's really changed them, maybe that can help us. But I think the onus is also on the neuroscience community and the ethics community that buys into this sort of biological, this medical model to do a better job than I could tonight, because it's pretty abstruse at first, to make plausible the way people really get captured. And to make plausible that even though looking from the outside, it really seems that this person is just willful and wants pleasure and is irresponsible, but actually, despite the fact that getting money, finding a dealer, obtaining drugs, using drugs is this long chain of meticulously planned voluntary acts, they really can't control it. Or if they can control it because they run into a policeman, the intense need, the craving builds up and builds up and builds up, and over time, it invariably defeats them until, if we had better and more available treatment, maybe more people would escape this cycle. Thank you very much.